Good morning and welcome to OSW Daily. OSW Daily, we're here Monday through Thursday, 8 a.m. on YouTube Live. What do? So we review current topics and discuss them with leading experts to get their view and opinions. And today, I'm happy to have Ken Van Someren with us. Ken is from Boost Cognition. Boost Cognition, the brain power people, enhancing performance in the workplace. So what are we going to talk about today? We're going to talk about being constantly connected. Changes in cognition affects our emotional lives. What does that mean? Build strong remote team cultures. And we're going to respond to Google's post, our interview that their CEO gave last week on turning its office onto on-site. So as I mentioned, Ken is with us today. Who is Ken? Ken is I call him an elite athlete. He may consider himself a former elite athlete, but given some of his exploits during the summer, I consider him an elite athlete. But Ken launched and led the GSK Human Performance Lab, a world-leading innovation center committed to human performance and consumer healthcare innovation. He's a key player in developing the high-performance system and led the Great Britain Olympic and Paralympic sports for London 2012 Games. He's also a key opinion leader and an international profile in the human health and performance. Ken, thank you for being with us this morning. It's great to have you back. I hope you're doing well.
Pleasure, Steve. Thanks very much. Great to see you, and thanks for the introduction.
No, thank you. And, it just sets it up nicely in a sense of who you are, your background, leads performance, studying that, and then bringing that into the workplace. And, with some great content here to jump off today. But, sort of things you've been talking about is all productivity, and productivity is about increasingly driven by knowledge and creativity, with organizations differentiated by their actual effective brain power. So taking that context and taking that through the lens, I want to sort of dig into the first piece of content that we sort of talked about, which was a Jacob Morgan video he posted where connectivity is obviously a big part of our future of work, but negative impacts of being constantly connected. Now, when I think of being constantly connected and I think about pulling away, I think about re-energizing my body. But what he's actually talking about, and it was through an interview he got with the CEO, was actually when we disconnect, only when we disconnect do our ideas start to flow. Only then does our brain really start to evolve and develop. And given the lens that you're coming through, I'd love to know what are your thoughts whenever you think of things like that,
Yeah, so I think this is a really interesting one. And, just going back to your earlier point about productivity and performance, and I think a lot of us have spent a lot of time over recent years trying to get a tangible and quantifiable measure of productivity in knowledge workers and in the knowledge sector. And for most, it's incredibly difficult to do that. So we end up needing for some sort of proxy for productivity, and perhaps not surprisingly coming from a high performance sport background, what we look at is performance. And individual and team performance at work, exactly as you say, is really about brain power and cognitive ability. So focus, decision making, problem solving, various other aspects of executive functioning. So these are really important. And some of the work we've done, I think, echoes exactly what this article is about. And I think there's a danger that as COVID came along and we all went into remote working, there was an element of how can we replicate and reproduce the way we were working, but doing it online. And so I think what a lot of companies tended to do is fill up their schedules with an awful lot of online video conferencing. Now, we know, because we've been measuring this, we've been looking at individual employee energy and stress, as well as elements of performance. And we know that it's incredibly tiring. So video conferencing is more tiring than face-to-face meetings. So what we don't have is, I guess, the commute time and the stress and the toll placed upon employees through that. But this phenomenon of always on and digital communications is incredibly hard. And of course, I've spoken so far about video conferencing, but underlying that, or superimposed on top of that, is of course the always on off email, Teams chat, whatever it might be. And I think where some organizations have got this wrong, it's about how do we keep people connected, almost for the sake of being connected and replicating the way they used to be. So let's have the chat function going all day. Let's have as many video conferencing calls as we can. And what we're seeing is maybe not quite burnout, but I would certainly recognize signs of being on the pathway towards burnout, and at best, underperformance. So going back to productivity and performance that we're clearly all trying to address and optimize, we're doing ourselves no favors here. And this one particularly, the quote in here about, when you push pause button on a machine, it stops. When you push pause button on a human, it starts. Now, this takes me immediately to the philosophy of training with athletes, where the training itself is the stress.
Right.
And the whole purpose of undergoing that stress is to then allow the body to adapt, or the mind to adapt, learn a new skill, get fitter, get stronger. But that only happens in the off time. And so just as with athletes, if we do too much of the stimulus and too much of the stress and not enough recovery, we're going to get overreaching and overtraining, a drop in performance, and quite possible detriments in mental and physical health. That's exactly what we see employees in the workplace as well. Yeah. If we're constantly on and we don't have enough time to come away from it, then again, we're going to be on the journey to burnout. We're certainly not going to be functioning at an optimal level. And I think a really interesting bit in here as well is about, where the big ideas come from, where the creativity comes from. And I think most organizations and teams probably have to ask themselves is, well, how much can people do that on their own versus how much compared to how much does it happen when we bring people together? And I'm sure you've seen this across different, within different functions of the business or different business organizations. So that balance changes.
No, absolutely. And the balance changes, but also it challenges between geographies, locations and cultures within the organization, teams within the organization, and obviously the tasks and functions that people need to do. There are some that individuals can be by themselves and can be highly functional, highly productive by themselves. But then to your point, there are those that need other people to be, collaborate with. And there's a few things you say, because I find this fascinating, and especially when we take it in the context of many organizations where you mentioned like productivity. How do we measure productivity? What are we going to do to actually measure that? And there's a lot of tools out there today that, do script, do watch, do take snapshots of what people are doing throughout the day. And is there a real danger then we're actually going to, almost, employees may gamify, or they may feel reluctant to take that time away, take that time to allow their brain to switch off, to let ideas formulate. I just know in how I behave. Sometimes the best work I do is actually when I'm not connected, because that's when the brain comes up with ideas, stimulates.
Yeah.
I take the opportunity to, watch other things and relay it back to my current situation. And it's like, how do we do those things,
And without taking us down too much of a rabbit hole of high performance sport performance, what we look at here is, what are the determinants of success? So what does our performance model look like? And that's where we need to start. And I think that's where any organization needs to start and say, what does high performance / productivity and success look like to us as an organization, as teams, and as individual employees? And that should be driving the way we're working. And I think there's a danger of too much online enforced collaboration, because it's exhausting, and digital connections are not the same as face-to-face connections. And I think we still need to do a better job of how can we maximize their value and their benefits. But similarly, if we spend too much in our own thinking, then we fall into the old traps of, working in silos or surrounding ourselves with like-minded people, even if they are just the voices inside our own minds. Collaboration is so important because it brings diverse experience and diverse perspectives, which means, we can very often get to a better solution, or we can certainly achieve some fast fails and rule out ideas far quicker. So I don't, in the context of this, I think this article raises some really good points around the balance, and too much connectivity is bad. I probably wouldn't entirely agree that all the good stuff happens when you're offline, because there'll be many times where, you say things out loud, you get inputs from colleagues and team members that just take you on and, trigger that stepwise change in thinking. But it's the balance.
So how do you get that balance? I mean, if you're managing a team and you're evaluating your team and their individuals, most managers know how their team perform, but whether they perform betterly individually, collectively. How do you start with some of those things?
Well, I think, part of it is this nebulous measurement of productivity and performance.
Yeah.
But again, our proxy measures, we can look at well-being. So we can look at mental energy, and we can look at mental stress with employees, and we can also look at cognitive function. So I think if this would be the ideal evidence-based way to go. Let's really understand, what does working from home look like? What does working in the office look like? What does this level of collaboration? What does this level of individual working look like? And then really get an objective evaluation of the pros, the cons, and the implication and the knock-on effects of all of those. Now, in the absence of being able to do that, because that's clearly a more targeted approach, we can't do that with 10,000 or 100,000 people that we might have in our organization. But the style of leadership and how we empower individuals has to be key here, has to be key. And when I look at some of the discussion around changes in leadership approaches or the new demands on leaders of remote working, I look at the list of what this requires, and you think, well, that's just good leadership.
Right.
Maybe not in absolutely every sector and every walk of life, but I would argue certainly in the knowledge-based sectors and for knowledge-based workers, that is how we get the best out of people. Yeah. We need to empower them. We need to give them take responsibility and have a think about, well, how do I create the best physical working environment, the best connectivity, and how can I get the best out of myself, both for my work productivity, but also for my own health, well-being, and sanity, let's face it.
Yeah, and I think it all starts with self, right? Be it you as an employee, be it you as a leader. You first have to look after yourself, right? We all have that airplane analogy. You put the airbag on your face mask on yourself first, and you have to look after yourself so you are ready and you are prepared each and every day you turn up for work. But you did mention cognition and cognition effect, and I just sort of want to pull up a second slide. I really want to get more on the title initially, just to see what sort of your perspective is, because I found this fascinating, and it just caught my eye, just the title alone. Simple changes in cognition affect our emotional lives. I'd love us to get your perspective on that and what that really means.
Yeah, and I guess if we were to take the sort of CBT or the cognitive behavioral therapy approach, you sort of flip that the other way and talk about how our emotions affect everything we do. Mm-hmm. But similarly, if we can get a handle and get an understanding, a level of control on our thinking and our behaviors and our attitudes, then we can control our emotions as well. So I think that's an important point. I think this schematic quite nicely sort of starts leaning into the circle of influence and the circle of concern as well, doesn't it? Of course it does. Mm-hmm. And where do we spend our time? And again, if I think about some of the work we've been doing with customers, it's very much, well, where we see the always on and the digital communications fatigue coming in is in part through a feeling of, I need to be seen. And it's in some here in the yellow circle of what I can't control. Mm-hmm. Now, circle of influence, circle of concern obviously is, how can we maximize the influence and certainly bring the circle of concern closer so we don't waste energy and time and effort worrying about the things that we can't control. And again, in sport, we talk about control the controllables. If you go out, start worrying about what your opponent may or may not do, then you're wasting your time and your energy and your focus. You need to be thinking about what you will do. Yes, it might be in response to how the game plays in front of you, but it's very much internalizing it. So I think where a lot of individuals struggle is when they are concerned about, are they not seen? how other people might think and what impact that's going to have. Now, we know if we look at some of these factors in the yellow circle, you can control other people's behavior. You can control other people's feelings or attitudes through good leadership, through good personal influence as well. And I think bringing all of this back to where we are now in the current climate is how can we properly understand what this looks like in today's context? Because I think we all had a pretty good grasp of this when we were in the workplace 4 days a week, maybe 5 days a week. But now in a very different environment, you and I can see each other. We can see each other when we speak between these broadcasts. You can't read body language in the same way as you can when you're in the same room. So I think we still need to be looking for better ways or different ways of understanding this.
And how do you then what's the best way that you've seen? I mean, obviously you've done deep dives into this for sports performance to change that input that actually does trigger that cognition effect, right? So how do you, I almost think this is inputs and outputs, and sort of the emotional life is the output if you want, but what's some of the best ways that you can really influence that output by adjusting or listening or hearing or reading about those inputs that actually do help the cognition effect?
Yeah, well, I think really importantly, it's a case of, what is it you're wanting to achieve and what can you control? And let's start with that. And that might be a very small circle to start with. But, we do a lot of work with people who might feel disconnected from their colleagues, from their bosses, not feeling particularly satisfied with their role in an organization. And there's always a reframing exercise that can be done about, okay, but what does this and what could this mean to you? And actually, every meeting, every dialogue, everything you do at work can be an opportunity. So where do you want to get to? And actually, what do you want to achieve? So rather than getting frustrated about, we don't get together often enough, or we're constantly on Teams or Zoom. Okay, well, think about, maybe we can't control that, but you can control the way you behave, and therefore you can control what you want to focus on and what you want to be able to get out of that. And again, intelligent leaders are going to be able to scale this up to, what does this mean for teams and what does this mean for organizations? But there's certainly no quick fix, and there's certainly no one size fits all.
Yeah, and obviously you just articulate so well. I was going to ask the question, but you kind of went there. The in-person, the in-office manager, and the remote manager, and just the conflicts and the different styles that need to be sort of adhered to is the wrong word, but recognized and acknowledged, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly that. And we can all think of very successful command and control type leaders, and we can all think of successful empowering, delegating type leaders as well. Painting the picture and the vision, and then engaging and inspiring people to go in that direction. Again, I would always look at when we are in knowledge-based sectors and knowledge-based industries where we have highly intelligent people, highly capable people, and particularly, I'm going to come back to this point around diversity. If we have diverse thinking, then we have to celebrate that. We have to let it run. If we don't, by a command and control or an overly prescriptive type leadership, we're going to stifle that.
No, that's great. Great guidance, actually, great thought. And then we think about diversity, we think about the culture, we think about how, the remote work and the remote office and how that then is going to be impacting what that actually means for organizations, and how do managers create that. And, we pulled up an article, and this was, this was written by a Remote Nation Institute. So this was, very geared towards remote working, but and as I read it, it was kind of there's things to acknowledge within the article itself, and I want to go back to a point you made earlier, because the guidance that's given for remote leaders, when I read it, it felt like this is just good leadership skills, but I think it's also having to recognize and acknowledging that actually the approach or the deliverable of those leadership skills just maybe has to be adjusted slightly or altered just because of the environment that we're operating in.
Yeah, I completely agree. And like you say, you look down the list of remote leaders, the skills and the capabilities they need, and you think, yeah, well, surely every leader needs that in whatever context. And if there's a silver lining to this cloud of COVID and all the challenges it's thrown upon us, is that we've got a burning platform here, and we need to think differently about how we do things. And you see this across sectors. You see it in sales, you see it in innovation, you see it in teaching and learning. How can we do things? Well, we have to do things differently, but within that, there's a real opportunity, I believe, and I've seen many cases in all of those sectors where it can be done better. Again, I think the trap, or where I get slightly disappointed, is when what we're trying to do is get back to the old, and not really use this as the burning platform that it could be. And we're thinking, okay, so we used to spend this much time together as a team. How do we now do it remotely and digitally? And I don't think that's the way to go.
What is the way to go then? I just want to push it there. So what is that way?
Well, this is why I'm going to duck the question completely and say that there's not a one size fits all. But I would go back to this first principles approach of, what does success look like? What are we trying to achieve? What is good performance for our organization, for our team, for the individual employees? Rather than, this is what it used to look like, let's try and recreate the same. Well, first question, did what it used to look like elicit and underpin high performance? Maybe it did. Okay, well, what did high performance look like? How can we now create it in a new setting, if we are to have a new setting, as opposed to all get back into the office?
Yeah.
I think another interesting point in this article here is, and the detail is important, now a large percentage of employees have discovered remote work as quality of life as well as financial benefits, and they want more of it. But that's not everyone. Right. There's a lot of people, and we've discussed this in the past, haven't we, who are struggling with the remote working. You don't have the social cohesion, you don't have the same level of collaboration. Life can be fairly mundane if you're stuck in house, at home, with all your personal affairs and of course all your work as well. So I think it's really important that we say, just as there's not a one size fits all for every organization, there's definitely not a one size fits all for every employee. And I think, these remote leaders, independence, focusing on the mission control rather than the protocols and the processes, and delegating and empowering their teams, letting people take a level of autonomy over how they're going to deliver, so long as they have certainty and clarity as to what's expected of them and what performance does look like.
Yeah, no, that is important, right? To really understand, so individuals know what actually is their deliverable, what they have to do, and what they have to achieve that. And I do have empathy for those that were really successful, but actually maybe struggling right now, from a leadership perspective. What are ways that you've seen that they could actually see guidance or be taught or learn ways to actually manage in this remote environment? And you're probably going to go back to your basics of, your fundamentals of what are the critical success factors, and then what do you do with those things, right?
Well, there's definitely that as a foundation, but I think there's also, you've got to ask yourself the honest questions. Is this working? Is this as good as it can be? And as leaders, are we putting our efforts in the right place? And are the employees benefiting from that? And our approach, as I mentioned, is we can objectively measure, because when we measure things, we often see a difference to self-reporting of what we see in surveys. But at the very least, we've got to be listening to our teams and to our employees. How are they feeling about this? How are they coping? Are they thriving? And I think there is a danger here where so much focus, and we've definitely seen it in our business, that so much focus has come into how do we survive this pandemic and how do we survive this challenge, rather than how can we thrive? And no one wants to, well, no one wants to be surviving, depends on the position you're in. But as a business, business, and as you don't want your employees just getting along and coping, you want them thriving, you want them excelling, you want them performing to the best of their ability. And I do think there's a big part here for leaders around certainty. There is so much uncertainty. And I think we might have touched on this in the last broadcast as well, where one of the biggest killers for stress and anxiety is that uncertainty. And I think it's often easy, as leaders develop in their own careers, they're faced with ambiguity and complexity and the need for flexibility on a day-to-day basis. But many of their direct reports wouldn't have that same perspective, wouldn't have the same experience, and might not have the skill set to be able to cope with that. So a critical requirement of leaders, I think, is providing certainty in uncertain times. And we absolutely are in uncertain times at the moment.
No, we certainly are, and I think certainty is a tough thing for a lot of folks to give right now, right? And although I know they'd love to give certainty and clear direction, but obviously we live in a changing world, changing environment. There's elements of New York that are going back into lockdown apparently, so it's just that constant involvement, right? It is a very fluid moment. But I want to go back to your point on surviving and thriving. I mean, are you seeing from your customers a shift in that mentality, or is it something that you're having to coach through?
There's definitely a shift from thriving to surviving, and that's understandable, I think, because at a high business level, the company needs to survive. While thriving, fine, we can come back to that if we're still here in 3 to 6 months' time. I completely get that, but I think for the bigger organisations who perhaps have a bit more stability through this and can weather the storm. There's a risk-averse approach, which is around, making sure we've got the PPE, we're following the health and safety, we're looking after things from an HR perspective and a public liability perspective. And it's understandable, but I think it's unfortunate that can pull a focus away from how can we be the best we can be.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. And, we talked about certainty, we talked about uncertainty, and, one of the organizations that provide a lot of shining light in direction, especially when it comes to workplaces, Google, it's been sort of the pioneer, the front light, if you want, in the sense of what they do, then people then try to follow. And obviously this last week, their CEO gave an interview about turning their offices into on-sites. And it's an interesting term. And obviously, I think what's been suggested is, we recognize that employees need to come together. They may not need to come together for the work they perhaps did before, but they need to come together for certain elements of their work. And I found it a really interesting term. I also found it a very interesting timing of whenever Google actually come out and give direction, because, people do listen, obviously, whenever Google gave this sort of direction. I don't know what you thought whenever you read the article.
Yeah, and I think what's very interesting is just how different the approach of some of these big companies are. And, so sometimes it's even in a relatively homogenous sector, the high-tech industry, we're seeing some quite different approaches. But what I read into this is I go straight to the quote down at the bottom of the slide. And this is about providing certainty.
Right.
Sundar Pichai here has identified, or his team have identified, that people are trying hard to plan. And if they can't plan and they don't know what's coming, it affects productivity. And the reason it affects productivity is there's a detrimental effect on people's motivation, their energy, and there's an increase in their stress levels. So again, rather than our athletes who is training hard and recovering well and improving performance, we're seeing this always-on phenomenon, going back to where we started, the always-on phenomenon, the digital fatigue, without the opportunity to pull back and properly relax and recover and look after themselves, because we have this underlying anxiety of what's happening next? What does the future look like? So I look at this and think, well, the cleverest thing Google have done here is provide some certainty. And to be honest, whether it's you're saying we're working from home and we've got on-sites just for a specific function, or we're all coming back on to do this. It almost doesn't matter. It's about providing the certainty.
Yeah.
What I would love to see, from my passion around human performance, is that again we say, well, why are we doing that? And it not just be driven by we've got big shiny real estate footprint that we need to fill, or isn't this good timing? We've got a lease event, we can let it go and let everyone work remotely. But actually think about what does performance look like, and then how do we create the environment, the mindset, and the capabilities within our people to be able to achieve that.
That's great, and I appreciate the insight into providing that certainty. I read it, but I never really connected the dots to certainty, and I think that's a really important thing the CEO has done for all Google employees. And look, Ken, we're way over, and it's just like I'm like, how did we get here so quickly? Because there's so many questions from what you just said. But look, I appreciate your insights. I appreciate you spending time as always, and being part of the network. So, folks, we have put links below where you can reach out to Ken directly or Boost Cognition, and do please reach out. Do say hello to Ken and thank him for participating and sharing his insights. And Ken, until next time, I appreciate it, mate. Take care.
No, great. Thanks, Steve. Bye for now.
Bye for now, mate.